In the coming weeks, the U.S. Supreme Court is set to rule on partisan gerrymandering. It's a practice political parties have increasingly relied on, giving an advantage to one party over another by redrawing district lines. Over the last year, 5 federal courts have struck down gerrymanders they deem partisan. Now it's up to the nation's highest court to determine whether judges can reliably detect the most egregious gerrymanders and establish rules to avoid a flood of new litigation. Chris Warshaw took a look at this in an article he wrote for the Washington Post. He's an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University, and he joins us now to explain. Chris, thanks for being with us. Walk us through the biggest concerns surrounding gerrymandering.
Well, I think the biggest concern is that partisan gerrymandering undermines democracy in our country. In recent years, gerrymandering has gotten ever more extreme. In the most extreme gerrymanders, it enables one party to win a majority of the seats in the legislature, and in many cases a large majority, with only a minority of the votes. And this undermines policymaking. It means that policymaking is biased in favor of the party that's conducting the gerrymander, so that voters from the disadvantaged party, so for instance, Democratic voters in places like Ohio, Michigan, and North Carolina, and Republican voters in Maryland, have little voice on important policy issues facing them. It also hurts political parties. It makes it harder for parties to recruit candidates and raise money, because in general, people don't want to run for office if it's a losing cause.
Chris, do both political parties engage in gerrymandering in this country, the Democrats and the Republicans?
Well, certainly both parties engage in gerrymandering, but in recent years, the most extreme gerrymanders have typically been conducted by Republicans. And that's largely because Republicans controlled many state legislatures following the 2010 elections. So this gave them an opportunity to conduct extreme gerrymanders. In the future, I would expect both Democrats and Republicans to conduct extreme gerrymanders. I think there's no reason to think this is a uniquely Republican or Democratic problem going forward.
Right, so that was sort of getting at the heart of my question. Although the Republicans have been in the news lately as the ones who have gerrymandered certain districts, as you point out, it's because of the power that they gained through some of the elections back in 2010. If those elections if the Democrats should win some of those state seats, you're saying that we could see gerrymandering on the Democrat side.
Exactly. I think in the future this will hurt both Democrats and Republicans. I don't think this is a problem for just Democrats. This is really a problem facing all of us in our democracy. So
this problem that you say is facing our democracy, explain to our viewers what is before the Supreme Court and how that could change or not change the way we operate in this country.
Well, the Supreme Court has never established standards for the legality of partisan gerrymandering and whether there's some point at which partisan gerrymanders become too extreme to be constitutional. There's a case from Maryland and a case from North Carolina that are before the court right now that give them an opportunity to establish rules for partisan gerrymandering and ban the most extreme gerrymanders, like we've seen in places like North Carolina and Maryland.
So how do you define extreme gerrymandering?
Well, I extreme it based on a situation where a party gets more seats than you would expect based on the number of votes they receive. And indeed, that advantage is larger than we've seen in almost all of recorded history. So in the work I've done, I've tended to compare the gerrymandering in places like Ohio and Michigan to maps over the last 40 years. And what you see in some of these cases is that the Republicans have a larger partisan advantage in Ohio and Michigan and some of these other states than really in almost any map over the past 40 years. And it's similarly for Democrats in Maryland. So these really are some of the worst gerrymanders that we've ever seen in our country.
You know, we talked about the fact that not one political party owns this when it comes to gerrymandering. But typically, and even through your article, we can see that with the Republican gerrymandering that's happened over the last 8 or 9 years, African Americans and people of color have been disproportionately affected by gerrymandering. What would the reverse look like? In other words, if Democrats were in control of some of these state legislatures, who would be disenfranchised?
Well, I think what you've seen in Maryland is that it's Republican voters in sort of ex-urban places that are close to suburbs and cities, where you can safely draw a Democratic district that's safely Democratic, even though really probably based on the complexion of these areas, you would expect there to be another Republican district.
Interesting. Finally, let me ask you about this, a related case. The Supreme Court is set to decide on the legality of adding citizenship questions to the 2020 census. The New York Times recently uncovered documents revealing the motive for the question is to give Republicans an advantage through gerrymandering. What could that case tell us about this one?
Well, I think that case informs gerrymandering in two ways. The most obvious effect of the census citizenship question is to lower response rates among Hispanics and other immigrant communities. So this will reduce the voting power of Hispanics for sure. And then I think the second effect, which came out in the memos that were released last week, is that the citizenship question makes it easier for state legislatures to draw legislative districts based on citizens, whereas currently legislative districts are drawn based on all population. And if you draw districts based on citizens rather than all people, then that would lead to less representation for Hispanics, other immigrant communities. And in general, that would help Republicans and hurt Democrats.
It's a really fascinating discussion. Chris Warshaw, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about your piece in the Washington Post.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, really good stuff. Thank you.